So malting is a three-step process. You steep, you germinate, and you kiln dry the grain. And in that process, a lot of chemical processes take place to change the nature of the grain so that it becomes suitable for brewing. And the first stage, the steeping stage, is a 48-hour period. So that started on Tuesday of this week. We loaded the batch in, we steeped it for an initial steep of 8 hours, and then we drained that initial steep, let the grain do what's called an air rest, and then we started another subsequent steep. In total, 3 steeps in a 48-hour period and 3 air rests. Usually at the end of that 48-hour period, you see what's called the chit in the grain, which is the early emergence of these little rootlets from the bottom of the kernel. And when you would look at a batch during that last phase of steeping, you would look in here and just see a lot of little white dots on the end of the grain. And that's always a really good sign, because that shows that the grain has a good germination rate, which is critical for making quality malt. What you're seeing now is grain that went beyond that initial steeping phase into the germination phase. So the rootlets are more significant. Some of them are quite long. A daily stir is in order. And the only real purpose that rootlets serve for the plant is to absorb nutrients in the soil. And for malting, really, it just poses a problem because the rootlets will want to start kind of matting together. And because it's day 2, and usually at this time of year it takes about 3 days to complete the germination phase, I'll start really checking the grain to figure out at what point in the process it is and how well it's modified, to figure out at what point we'll start kilning, which is the 3rd phase. It's softening up, so if you rub it between your fingers, there's a nice little chalky dust. So this is all the white stuff in here is like it's the starchy endosperm, which is where starches are going to be broken down into sugars to make fermentables for beer or for spirits. And this little shoot inside there, that would be what would grow the plant eventually if this was in a field and we were growing a plant of barley. But since we're malting it, we're going to let it grow and only let the shoot get as big as the length of the grain, and then we'll start kilning it as soon as that happens. And the kilning will stop the growth of the plant, but it's not hot enough that it will denature or kill any of the enzymes that are needed for breaking complex starches into simple sugars for brewing. So that's one way that we try to determine when a batch of malt is ready to be kilned, is through the length of this little acrospire. And then the other way is just really through sensory, through smelling it, touching it, feeling it. Again, doing this thing called rubbing the grain between your fingers and feeling for the softness of the modification of the grain. This batch of barley was grown here in Massachusetts, about 5 miles down the street. So basically these vessels are little air-conditioned units. So when we're steeping and germinating, we want to make sure that the grain is at generally in the low 60s Fahrenheit. We have a chiller downstairs, so we're able to chill the air as it's blowing up through the bottom. All kilning is making sure that we have a malt that is dried down to about 3% moisture. And in that drying process, we're also creating some of the flavors that you would associate with a nice malty, sweet, toasty flavor.